Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in for this breaking news almost live on the Canadian Real Estate Channel. I want to thank the team at the Canadian Real Estate Channel for giving us the opportunity to come on here and inform the real estate community of what's happening and what's going on. And I know I can talk a lot. It's my gift of gab, but I wanted to bring friends to talk about this one. So if you see in the comments before, this is regarding the NDP's bill for the Rent Stabilization Act. And if anyway, it's a little hidden. We're like stabilization, it's good. We have that 2.5% cap already in place. No. They want to go a little bit further. So they want to really try to implement full rent control in between tenancies. So the best people that I can bring you now for this time frame, they're also going to be a guest speaker at the Ontario Landlords Watch Housing Conference happening on October 1st in Cambridge, Ontario. But first, I want to introduce to you Caitlin McIntyre, who is a real estate lawyer and also a tenant. So who else to give us some feedback on what this proposed thoughts on this proposed bill and what it can actually do to the industry if supported by the Conservative government. So let's get Caitlin involved and have her on the screen.
Thank you very much, Kayla. It's nice to virtually meet everybody today.
We're going to be meeting in person soon. We're going to hug each other. We're going to be able to eat some dinner. Like I'm itching for this. It's been 2 years waiting to have everybody in person again. Thanks so much for coming on and being able to give your thoughts on this bill. Now, quick, give me one sentence of what your first impression of when you found out about this.
So my first impression is that we are going to completely disincentivize landlords. And I'm saying that as someone who currently rents my property, but there's not enough incentives as it is for people to take on the role of being a landlord. And essentially it's the government putting the responsibility for public housing in the hands of private persons. So in every way, I'm not a fan.
Gotcha. Now, if we can get another person to join in on this, it's going to be a paralegal / investor who is going to be able to come on here and tell us their thought process of this bill. We're going to get into details and why we think it's happening. I already knew that this was going to be coming down the pipe by having real journalists call me regarding the rent increases, and they said that they are communicating with elected officials and they're trying to find ways to implement full rent control. So you knew it was coming. It just didn't know who or when or why. But we're excited to have Andrew Choubeta, who is a paralegal here in Ontario and also an investor himself. He's going to be coming on here and he's going to be able to join this conversation. And we want you to join in on this conversation as well. So get into the comments, go onto YouTube on the Canadian Real Estate Channel or the Canadian Real Estate Channel Facebook page. Put your comments, put your thought process so that, we can share this with our elected officials at the same time. Just have this open dialogue, something that our elected officials don't do. We're going to do it for them. So thank you, Andrew, for coming on.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
I just asked Caitlin, give me one quick sentence, just your first impression of a bill such as the NDP's bill of the Rent Stabilization Act. What was your first impression?
My first impression is probably not a good decision, to say the least. Not at all. Not at all. No, it's effectively what it's doing, as Caitlin said, it's incentivizing, it's taking away all incentive of landlords who are doing their jobs, right? You're placing all of the responsibility, liability, and everything just being dumped on one side. And it's very, very distressing. And not only that, you're also seeing a cap on rental rates, which is very bizarre as to why someone would think this was a good decision in the first place at all, right? It's a give and a take, right? You want to sit somewhere in the middle where landlords are still around and they're able to provide affordable housing and housing for any matter, right? Regardless if it's market rent or lower market rent. And with this, it's highly distressing to see that the government's placing a lot of the responsibility on landlords because, there's not enough inventory in the market and, you're seeing rental prices increase. But this is not a great way of trying to get this fixed.
No, it's definitely not. And so being an advocate for 12 years and knowing how slow of a process it is to advocate for landlords' rights. And it's not that we're not just advocating for, just landlords' rights. We're advocating for our good tenants, and our good tenants are going to suffer if this bill gets the support from the conservative. Now, everyone will say we have the conservative government. Don't worry about it. And the NDP tried to do this bill back last year, and it went through first read, got us little concerned. We put the call to action out there for our members to contact their elected officials and the Minister of Housing in order to try to stop it. And it did get voted down on the Monday, which we were very pleased to see. But to say that they're bringing it back again, it's a little concerning, especially we have a housing crisis. It is getting worse. But we have to be implementing different rules and registrations when it comes down to the Residential Intensive Act and Landlord and Tenant Board that is incentivizing the landlords to continue into this type of industry. But sadly, we have the reverse happening. We see more landlords getting out of Ontario. They're getting into Alberta, Florida, Georgia, Costa Rica, Belize. I just gave you guys a lot of these popular places right now if you're looking to jump boat. But let's go into, when I watched this video, I was lying in bed last night and I'm like, my husband's like, are you done watching? I'm like, no. I'm watching this. And when they talk about the full rent control that they're trying to implement, and they're trying to do it where it's going to be the same rent that the previous tenant had paid. So this is like, normally if a tenant leaves, we can go ahead and reposition the rent to market rent, especially because, with 1.2% this year, 2.5% next year, we have to be able to do it. But their main argument here is that landlords are trying to evict tenants unlawfully in order to raise the rent above the current rent that they're paying. And that's why they're incentivizing to try to prevent landlords from increasing rent. Because if you can stop landlords from kicking out tenants in order to raise rent, there's no initiatives or no incentives now for the landlords to do that, because now they can't raise the rent no matter which tenant is in there. Do you think this is fair? And what is going to be the ripple effect from this? We'll start with Caitlin.
So I don't think this is fair. And now I do understand that there is a select few number of landlords who do take advantage of their positions. They do use bullying tactics to evict tenants, and they do cause problems in a legal sense. But the majority of the actual landlords per capita here in Ontario are individuals or very small businesses that are not necessarily doing this in any major profit margin as it is. So they're already almost taking their shirt off in order to keep providing the housing that they're providing with the current restrictions on rent increases. And so all we're going to be doing is taking those same small individuals and making it impossible for them to continue on in their career and still make money. And for those people who do it as a side career or a secondary way to make money, they're not going to have the time to comply with some of these new requirements or to deal with this new structure. So they're going to want to exit and focus more on their actual work. This is not something that's going to incentivize landlords. It's going to disincentivize them. It's going to convince them to leave the market. And for those, let's say, few, maybe massive organizations that tend to get some of the bad marketing and some of the bad news in Toronto, for example, it's not going to impact them. It's not going to impact the larger organizations that potentially are the problem right now, in accordance with the same media that the NDP is currently putting forward. It's going to impact individual landlords, smaller landlords, and the landlords that are actually the better landlords who put a face to a name and really assist their clients. And as well, there's some concerns with respect to the lack of privacy measures that are going to be put into place with this new legislation, which could also require all landlords to disclose their address on a public forum, where any potential tenant who's looking to lease from their unit will be able to get access to the landlord's contact information. So unless you set up a PO box or hire a professional agent to act as like your property management company, individual landlords will end up having to give up their personal information. And again, I'm a tenant, so I do sympathize with the tenants quite a bit. I myself sometimes struggle to pay rent, but forcing landlords to take on almost 100% of the responsibility for the rental relationship while not addressing any of the concerns that landlords have brought up about the current broken nature of the system is just a recipe for disaster as far as I'm concerned. And as a real estate lawyer, I know one of the biggest problems with the rental market is just that there is not enough actual stock in the rental market, like actual houses to rent from. And if I were a private landlord and seeing this coming in, I would be very hesitant to remotely continue my business, because not only would I be losing money, and that means if I've got someone grandfathered in for the last 15 years and I haven't been able to raise the rent appropriately for the last 15 years, guess what? That property's grandfathered for life now, because I can only charge the new tenants as much as the existing tenants have been charged. So it's going to bankrupt some people. And I will not be surprised if we see more and more actual houses being removed from the rental market, because it would be, to be honest, probably less expensive for some of these landlords to actually just stop renting the houses out completely and sit on them until the market recovers so they can sell them than it would be for them to continue renting to new tenants at the same amount.
Right there. So this is where I've been watching the market, watching the rules and regulations coming out with short-term rentals. So they went after short-term rentals first because they knew that if something like this comes out, even just this article in itself is enough to scare many investors out of the industry. But now that they have implemented that, now what we're going to be seeing is that people would flock to short-term. Well, they went under short-term rental licensing. They put a lot of stipulations. Certain cities ban it unless you're a resident. So you can kind of see that. Then they have the vacancy tax. You know, they put in a vacancy tax in Ottawa in order to try to defer people from leaving their places empty in order to still work that cash flow. Now, Andrew, we're looking very quickly with the concept that this is, you know, I always want to let people know it's NDP. Yes, they're not in power, but we're in a housing crisis and we don't know what could actually potentially happen. And we need to continue being loud and voicing our concerns. But you poke some holes through this act, this bill that is now going to be proposed. Hopefully it just gets sunk in the dust. But at the same time, if we don't have people like us talking about it, then it might just get underneath our nose and we don't know what to do with it. What was your major concerns from reading this in particular bill?
So, the bill itself has a lot of issues with it, right? In my opinion. Now, to say the least. But, you know, the biggest shiny thing on the wall is now, you know, the rental registry along with the cap on rental rates. That's the thing that everyone's going to be looking at on this. However, when you take in more of a reading into it, you're starting to see a lot of other administrative changes with the Landlord and Tenant Board that are very, very, very concerning, right? So you're seeing now the board would have the ability to fine a landlord, right, of the excess of $1,000 per day for maintenance. That's the first thing. Second thing, in addition to that, is that if the board does have a fine levied, then any application brought forward to them can be rejected. So a landlord wouldn't be able to seek remedy for non-payment of rent or damage to a property. So what you can see, like usually situations when they're brought forward to the Landlord Tenant Board, they're not black and white, right? They're gray, sort of sitting in between. And although I can sympathize, because I'm sure the idea about this was that this was supposed to give, you know, tenants a little bit more teeth on getting their landlords to maintain a stable housing unit. However, what occurs with this is that you're going to find that a lot of smaller landlords are going to be penalized a lot more, and it's going to disincentivize them to continue to go back, because getting fined at $1,000 a day, I sincerely hope that wouldn't be something that regularly would happen quite often. And not only that, not being able to seek remedy. And, you know, we see files like this all the time where, you know, someone could be fined by city housing standards or, you know, with the municipality. At the same time, they're going through issues with the Landlord Tenant Board. But those two organizations don't contact each other. So you're sort of stuck as a landlord in the middle, and you may be trying to actually seek remedy, right? You may actually be trying to fix these issues at the property, and you may be dealing sometimes, you know, with a difficult tenant at a property that's caused some of those damages. And it places you in a very bizarre position where you're penalized for not having a good housing unit, but you're still trying to seek remedy against the person that's causing the damage, and there's nothing you can do. And not only that, your application could get thrown out, which is, in my opinion, very, very distressing. Because I can think, you know, and like Caitlin said, this is not going to harm the individuals with 500 units. This is not going to have significant issues with the people that own thousands of units throughout Canada. This is going to harm the individuals that own 2, 3, right? And as we know right now, going through a landlord and tenant board matter can take 7, 8, 10 a year, longer months, right? I have files from back in 2019 that haven't been finished yet. So, if I can imagine this registry as well, you on an administrative level, how are they going to keep up with all of this, and how are they going to because it's placing the board in sort of a regulatory situation, right, where they're having to keep up and keep updated, along with the very severe confidentiality issues I would have with it, having a disclosure of which landlord's owning what, and then which properties are theirs, right? It may place a very dangerous situation for some landlords, right? Unless you have to pay out for a PO box or another agent to do it for you. But I can see what they thought they were trying to do, and this falls short very significantly, right? They were trying to make a better system for tenants, but this is not how you do it, not at all, right? I think probably placing it into a better situation where having more rental units is going to be more important. Increase the stock, increase the inventory. You won't have issues with high rent.
They have in the article regarding after, Doug Ford had implemented no rent control on units built after November 15th of 2018, and to incentivize developers and investors to create supply of housing. And they think that is another reason why they're seeing the rents increasing. There's articles in the Regional Waterloo coming from the Regional Waterloo stating that landlords are applying to the Landlord and Tenant Board to raise the rent above the guidelines, which if they only had the education to understand, A, there's a fee for it. 2, it could take 2 years to be put in. And number 3, you have so many different requirements, ones that we wish were included to get approved, but the board does have to approve it. So for them to come out with very broad statements like that, not knowing that when people are waiting 7 months, 8 months, pretty much 3 years in order to get themselves at the Landlord and Tenant Board or have a hearing, the system is completely broken. I wish they would spend more time looking at and exploring solutions at the Landlord and Tenant Board in order to alleviate the backlog so that tenants who do have an issue have a faster, efficient way of being heard by an adjudicator or from the board in himself. But right now, they just want to keep poking and playing politics and trying to blame the Conservative government into causing this mess. But in reality, we have too many hands in the cookie jar. This is where too many cooks in the kitchen, whatever we want to call it, but they're all doing their own in particular thing on trying to encourage housing supply, but they're missing the real concept that when they keep putting restrictions and penalties on investors, we're losing our supply, we're not gaining supply, and it's just hurting our tenants who are, obviously struggling to keep up with the rents now. Just like they just spent, $19 million between the Landlord and Tenant Board and the Ontario Land Tribunal to help alleviate the backlog. Well, if the cities weren't, not just approving these type of developments, we wouldn't have to go to the land tribunal. And if we gave some money to our tenants, and help them in rent relief, we wouldn't have to deal with, having to hire more adjudicators at the Landlord and Tenant Board. But we have to incentivize this, just like the way that the landlords, if they're caught doing something shady, you got to ask yourself why. I'm trying to get them out. I want to move my kid in for a year just because the rent is so low. If there was that mediation, that negotiation, that landlords and tenants can negotiate to raise their rent to make it fair for both, especially if they move in other occupants within that rental dwelling and able to raise the rent there, and also giving us a little bit to the point of inflation, because 2.5% is not enough to cover our expenses. Now, there is a portable housing benefit. I don't know if you guys know about this, that helps tenants. So if you're a tenant on government housing, waiting for government housing, if you remove your name off the list, you could be approved for the portable housing benefit, which gives them an additional $350 towards the rent. Utilizing some of these government services in order to help the tenants be able to afford the rent is going to be key into keeping people housed. But I know a lot of our landlords, the interest rates are rising. What are these landlords are supposed to do? Now, Caitlin, Andrew, I want you guys to give me a solution. So let's say they obviously think landlords are doing this to be shady, kicking people out, and trying to get out of it. But obviously, investments in rentals is a business and should be treated as such. What way would you want to implement a solution that is going to benefit the landlord, but also the tenants?
So I'll go first. So I think there's kind of a two-tiered solution here. Now, I don't quite know how it's going to be implemented in the future, given that we really have a politically diverse province. That's part of the problem, is we end up fighting a lot in our politics instead of actually coming up with mutually beneficial solutions. So one benefit would be to further incentivize the actual development of affordable housing, because right now we're not at affordable at all. It's just attainable housing. Nothing is really affordable anymore. And the developers, they're very quickly losing any benefit to creating new housing. Even in Toronto right now, the barriers that developers face with respect to building and the qualifications that they have to meet and the expenses that they have to incur are driving the costs of condos and buildings and houses up significantly, to the point that even those investors, they're not making their money back barely. There's zero benefit to investing, because you're going to end up either zeroing out, or you're going to end up at a loss. So one thing that I think would be a real solution is if the government actually, first of all, gave a little bit of a break to developers. The levies and fees that they have to pay and the hoops they have to jump through to develop is part of why housing is so expensive right now, and why things like condo fees are as expensive as they are to start. So I really think having the government step in and assist with that is going to really alleviate the problem. And to be honest, if the government wanted to invest as much as they're investing in something like the Landlord Tenant Board, they should instead look to, as you mentioned, Kayla, actually provide some tenants with assistance with rent. They should be actually taking the forefront and moving forward on being the solution themselves, because we can't keep privatizing the housing issue the way the government has been. It's putting the burden on individual landlords to come up with these solutions for housing availability instead of actually doing anything about them themselves. And part of that problem is that they will not work with developers. Everything they've been doing is working against developers. The second step, I would say, in solving this problem is to completely overhaul the Landlord Tenant Board. They put in so much money into dealing with the rental or the rent arrears cases in particular. I'm sorry, I've had rent arrears cases for some of my clients since January, and we still don't know if they've actually served the tenants. Like, there has been zero updates whatsoever. They are not prioritizing rental disputes at all. And it's extremely detrimental, because you're creating a situation where people can essentially squat in these houses, and legitimate tenants who have paid their rent on time every year for their entire life are not able to get housing. And it's frankly ridiculous. In addition, this new legislation creates a bunch of extra steps that the landlords have to take. And they can't even do their jobs as it is now. And I mean, I'm really outing myself by saying this publicly live.
No, it's true. It's on YouTube.
Get in front of the board a lot. So if there's any,
I'm right here with you. I'm right here with you.
But it's just to the point, like, I honestly think it's a significant problem. And as well, the hiring process for adjudicators at the board is a significant problem. The people that they are selecting do not fundamentally understand the legislation. They do not understand due process, and they don't understand the law. They are not lawyers. They are not legal professionals. They are often people who've been in social work, which is good to a certain degree, but they don't even understand their own legislation. I had an order this year that said, even though the tenant never physically occupied a trailer in a trailer park, they still got to be a tenant, even though the legislation specifically says you are not a residential tenant unless you physically use it as a primary residence. Not a residential tenant if it's a vacation home. And I had an adjudicator say, oh, well, I'm still inclined to find them to be a tenant. And I'm like, yeah, a tenant, but not a residential tenant, ma'am. But unfortunately, she did not understand the baseline of the law. So that meant my clients either had to pay these people to leave, or they had to deal with the divisional court. Now, would they have been successful at the divisional court? Probably, because there's a ridiculous amount of case law that supports that someone's not a tenant in a trailer park unless it's their primary residence, right?
Mhm.
But that would have been expensive. And unfortunately, we can't continue to follow the landlord tenant board's current path and trajectory because they are not consistent with the rest of the law, and they're not even able to function using their existing program. So by adding all these additional steps and factors, I really think we're just overcomplicating things, and we're going to end up in situations where more landlords who are bad are going to be able to get away with the things that they're doing because tenants are not going to be heard. No one's going to be heard because the board is going to have to try to do things like keep track of money that landlords owe them, keep track of registered properties, who lives in those properties, how
Don't
much.
give them too much, guys. Like they're barely able to take it in for our L1 application right now. Don't let them have
Exactly.
how
So
many
my
Very
days
much
of
so.
release.
Very
So
much
that's
so.
that's kind of my second point is we just absolutely need to overhaul the landlord tenant board, and we don't need to be doing that by giving them even more tasks to do because they can't really properly do the tasks they have now. So
Yeah, no, the process as it stands right now is incredibly broken. Incredibly simple, right? And then there's a lot of representatives that are sort of speaking out like, the canaries in the coal mine, trying to explain to everyone just how damaged the system is as it stands right now. When, like, as you said, Kayla, when they were dumping all of this money into the landlord and tenant board to get new adjudicators, but that's exactly what they did. They got lightning fast adjudicators as quickly as they possibly could from all walks of life, which in some cases is great. But what ends up happening is you have very inexperienced adjudicators, right? So I had an order actually of a gentleman who was removed from a property for an L1, so non-payment of rent, and the excess of $35,000 in non-payment of rent. It took more than a year and a half to get to the board. Once it got there, he was evicted, and then he didn't show up to the hearing. 2 weeks after the eviction date, the sheriff had already gone into the property. They were able to get a stay of eviction. And you know what he did? Well, this man went back to the property and broke into the property. The police were called, they showed up, and this man had an order that said he could be there. So the police officers walked back, didn't do anything, didn't remove him from the property. And we had to go back to the board again to get another hearing. And we had to start the non-payment of rent situation again.
ugh.
So, this situation happens over and over again. And people, because I know what people are going to say, right? They're going to see and watch this, and they're going to say that, well, you know what? It doesn't happen often where there's that much non-payment of rent. Well, if it's 2% of the time, there's a lot of units out there. 2% suddenly becomes not rare. So when you look at my files, I have countless that are above $35,000, right? Hundreds and thousands of dollars in damages, right? And there's nothing you can really do to get an urgent hearing unless it's the most grave of situations. But then you start getting numb to some clients because, effectively, there's no point of sending an urgent hearing request in, at the very least. So you're seeing this same problem over and over and over again of the same issues over and over and over again. And I do believe the board needs to be completely and utterly overhauled from start to finish. And I understand, they're trying. I get it. They are dumping money into the new portal system, but the portal system doesn't work as it stands right now. It's atrocious. It's based off a Salesforce system that has bugs, glitches. There's sometimes you can get your documents uploaded at best. Sometimes you don't even know you have a hearing date associated, so you're frantically looking for it inside your emails. Sometimes I get orders for people that, there aren't even my clients, and I have to contact them and figure out as to why it was sent to me. I've had notices of hearings sent out to me, and I've gone to the hearing just wondering, hey, by the way, did I have a client put me on a record? I'm not sure as to why I'm supposed to be here. And that happens, right? So, and people don't really see this side of it, right? And the biggest issues that we're seeing is, and especially with my clients, is the education of trying to explain to a landlord, this process is terrible. And you're not going to enjoy just the uphill battle of dealing with the administrative things, right? So many times our office is brought on, not because of the legal aspects, it's because the landlords can't navigate the system. And I don't know a single person like today that can do an N4 non-payment of rent L1. I just can't advocate anyone to do it on their own. I just can't.
No.
Because it's going to get thrown out on technicality, on missing a specific date or whatever it may be. And the board adjudicators are offering zero leniency to landlords. Zero. So if you make a mistake, out the door it goes. And at best, you're still dealing with the administrative issues of not being able to get your PIN to work on the portal, not being able to access the portal system, not being able to look or view any of the documentation from the other side. And again, it's the same thing, and you get the same answer from the board. We endeavor to provide the best services possible as we can at the earliest convenience. And I'm sure you've heard that and seen that multiple times, Caitlin.
Too many times.
Right. And then at this point, you try to appease the client by sending an email out, and then they get that response too. And then they just feel defeated. And it's the same thing over and over again.
This whole system is discouraging investors, and even with the NDP's Stabilization Act, they really think that this is not going to discourage development, and they think that their plan can also encourage the duplexes, the triplexes, like the type of form of housing that they feel is going to be a solution. But they're not into listening to the landlords, because we do have landlords associations. They've reached out to the NDPs, and no one wants to sit there and listen. I've invited them to come on a Facebook Live and say, hey, let's battle this out. Let's just have this conversation. Let's open the dialogue, because you're going to try to persuade, all levels of government in order to think what you've created is a good thing, but not know what the trickle effect is. Similar to the water billing policy. They thought, great, the city is not going to be on the hook for delinquent water bills. We're going to make it the landlords. The landlords are probably going to include it into their rent to make it more affordable for tenants. And instead, landlords kept it separate. They also can issue an N5 application in evicting the tenant because of them not paying their water bill. And now you have a tenant now going to be homeless because the city didn't want to lose out on any delinquent utility bill. And now they thought that was a good idea. And 10 years later, we now have social agencies now coming out and saying, you're right. We do have people now coming to me in arrears for their utilities and at the risk of eviction. So we have to go ahead and try to do whatever we can in order to, try to mediate this situation.
And honestly, further disincentivizing smaller landlords is not the way to do it, because in my experience, the smaller the landlord, and even small businesses as landlords, the less units they have, the more attention they can pay to individual tenants, and genuinely the better landlords they can be. But the way that we are approaching everything right now is essentially specifically targeting good landlords or good landlords. I actually have no problem with corporate landlords. I have represented a number of corporate landlords and property management companies. And honestly, I think that's also great. But what we really need to be doing is actually revamping things on a government level with respect to incentivization, and also with respect to things like zoning. Even for someone to apply to get the zoning changed, for example, the neighborhood that I rent in and live in, there is no ability to build duplexes. There is no ability to build triplexes. And if I wanted to do something, because I've got a fairly large property I'm renting here, if I wanted to buy something like this one day and I decided, I'm going to build something in the backyard, I'm going to build another unit. No, I wouldn't be allowed to do that because of the zoning here. And for a developer to actually go in, or even a builder to go in and obtain that zoning variance, is an absolute nightmare. So it's not even convenient or easy for developers to make affordable housing. And if they think that this kind of structure and this kind of system that they're introducing is going to still allow for the incentivization to build affordable housing, to build duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, they're completely wrong. The only thing it's going to incentivize is for builders to just look at luxury, like to just be building luxury buildings. Even here in Waterloo, we've seen a massive slowdown in the building of multi-tenant units and things like that in comparison to the big developments that are going up for massive houses that will be purchased by someone who can afford a couple houses and who certainly won't be renting them out under this kind of legislation. But it's just taking away the opportunity for anyone to make any kind of money in the rental industry, which means, honestly, either the government needs to completely step in and make affordable housing themselves, and they are the ones responsible for affordable housing,
or they got to get out of our business,
or they've got to let landlords at least function, right? And again, I'm not a landlord. I'm a tenant. I pay rent every month. I can't afford a house right now, and I'm a lawyer in my 30s. So really, I'm talking as someone who should be speaking against this. Most of my friends rent, but the reality is the reason it's so hard to rent now, the reason landlords have such intense requirements for identification, for references, is because they know if a tenant gets in there and that tenant is a bad apple, that is it for them. I even had a call this week with a landlord who hadn't fully signed a lease with a new tenant, but the new tenant knew when the move out day was, showed up at the unit, convinced the old tenant to give the keys over, and that was it.
Yep.
That was it. Now my client, I was like, I am so sorry to say it, but unless you're ready to spend the next 2 years fighting this and potentially have this tenant pay you nothing during that 2-year period, you might just have to live with it. I know they didn't fully sign the lease. I know they didn't pay you first and last. They only paid you first. I know they didn't do all this other stuff, but they've taken occupation. There's no one who's going to remove them. And honestly, because you were discussing the lease with them, even though it wasn't fully signed in the form that you sent, which was the correct form, by the way, it was the actual Social Justice Tribunal's form. Still, there would be no way to get them out at this point in time. That's it. Even though everything was done illegally on the tenant's end. So it's just making it more complicated for landlords to be landlords, and it's making it harder for tenants to qualify for properties unless they do something shady like that. So really, I just don't see how this could possibly create more affordable housing. I just think it's going to remove inventory and stock, as Andrew was saying, from the existing market. And it's just going to create a further crisis as far as I'm concerned.
Everyone likes the idea of a mom and pop landlord, but then again, you actually have to protect them. You actually have to do that. There's active steps that you have to do to make sure that they stay in business. And some of these guys are not making a lot of money. They're making $300 or this property
some are dishing out of their own pocket.
or they're losing money, right? They've held onto the property because it was their original family home and they're living somewhere else, right? And then this property is their retirement fund. And that's a lot of these people where they own one property or two. And I had a client recently who purchased a property just here in Hamilton, and they made the purchase of the property, and there was a family that was living there. Family sold the property, and the mother moved out. Well, the tenants, the occupants, the children stayed there. They were able to convince the police officers that showed up to the property after closing that they were tenants. Now, my client is stuck in an opposition because the police, Hamilton Police, Toronto Police, Niagara Police, have a mandate where they will not remove someone from a property, regardless. If they live there, they will not remove them.
Yeah.
So now I'm stuck, and I trying to get this tenant out of the property, or occupant, let's say, but the police won't remove them. The Landlord Tenant Board certainly doesn't have jurisdiction for this, and yet I'm forced to figure out what these people's names are and potentially do a non-payment of rent form. But this is the issue. There's no rental rate. There's never been a rental rate, but the police have decided that they are tenants now. And effectively speaking, they've been in that property for 4 months and they're squatting on it, and they will not be removed as of right now. And the sheriff can't be done.
So the only way you can remove, because I've actually dealt with this once before, because I do real estate, of course, where it was friends of a tenant who just decided to stay, didn't pay any rent. And the way the landlord got them out, the first one got arrested. And when he was gone, the landlord changed the rent and gave the second one a new key. Second one, changed the locks, sorry, and gave the second one a new key. Second one got paid out. And it was a lot of money. It was more money than it should have been paid, but it allowed the person to leave. Because the only way you can deal with that situation is you go to the Landlord Tenant Board and you file an application to determine if the act applies. And the terrifying thing is I did that, and the board decided it did apply to someone who had never physically lived in the place. Just was like, oh, I want to use it as a vacation home. I'm like, great, not a residential tenant, right? And part of the decision was because I used the word tenant in my argument, and I tried to explain to the adjudicator, there's different types of tenants. I am not saying they are a residential tenant, but they still rent. So they are a tenant, just like there are commercial tenants. But still, because I used that word, and because they had inherited the unit from someone previous, the board was like, oh yeah, the act does apply. But I bet you anything, had we gone to then try to evict them, they might have said they didn't have jurisdiction. right? So this is the catch-22 here, is that you have to bring an application, and I think it's an A1 application.
It's an A1, yeah.
Yeah, an A1 application to figure out, does the actual act apply? And quite frankly, you're likely in front of an adjudicator who isn't familiar with any of the case law beyond the act, feels like they don't have to think about any of the case law beyond the act because they're not bound by common law, and probably doesn't actually understand the nature of the act itself or the language itself. And so they might make the complete wrong decision. You get in front of a different adjudicator who looks at it and says, you know what? We don't have jurisdiction to deal with this matter. So what do you do? Honestly, I've also seen another case where what the person ended up doing was filing for bankruptcy. They lost everything.
Yeah.
They lost everything. The house was repossessed. And you bet your butt the bank was able to get that tenant out.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Andrew, you told me something the other day about bankruptcy for non-payment of rent.
Oh, that lovely thing. I hate this tactic. I'm always sometimes like concerned about talking about it because it gives people ideas.
It does.
Yeah.
So be very vague with it, and we'll talk about it more at the conference.
Yeah. So basically speaking, if you have a non-paying tenant can make steps through bankruptcy and basically wiped out all the previous, rental arrears, which would be also catastrophic if he was working on one of my applications. And now, as you know, Kayla, how long things can take, and
Years.
adjournments and not showing up, and then the stay of eviction and waiting for that, and that gets adjourned, and then you get hit with bankruptcy, and then you got to start all over again, right?
Now, this is the question. Is the government wanting to be the only landlord out there? Do they want to have control over this, or why would they want to continue to put those barriers in front of these investors who are trying to help with the situation? And as you can tell, like when we're talking about the NDP and the rent control, and we talk about a database of landlords, like obviously we'd love a database of tenants, because in order to bring your previous tenant back to the landlord and tenant board, or even to serve them as small claims court, you need to find out their forwarding address. And they're not bound to giving us our address, their address, but they do have a requirement to update their license. Can we start serving our tenants through Service Ontario in order to say this is proper serving of documents, in order to make sure that we do have that connection? Because landlords technically don't move. So they're always going to be able to get through to their landlord. But you can see how the lack of knowledge that our NDP have, they don't have that. There's massive problems now that we should be focusing on, not trying to introduce more that is just going to complicate things and also drive more money, more investment money out of Ontario. Because if they do.
And the government's not interested in taking over. The government is actually not very good at taking care of people from a social perspective. And to be completely frank, I would rather we looked at something like universal basic income than introducing something like this, because we are going to hemorrhage our system. We are investing so much money in things like the landlord tenant board, in these processes, that we might as well just be paying people basic income every year. And I'm not necessarily a fiscally conservative person all the time. I also consider myself quite socially liberal. But when I look at this, I know the government is not going to take this over. I've worked for charity organizations before, like Community Living, where we are housing and helping people who have extreme developmental disabilities and cannot care for themselves. And when I tell you the government makes that job harder for these nonprofits and not easier, I mean it. So if they can't even assist the most vulnerable people, they certainly are not interested in assisting the average tenant. So what they are trying to do is honestly pass the buck. It's a political move. They're looking great when it comes to the voters, because a lot of voters are renters and they are going to like what they are hearing. They're not going to see the actual future that's in front of them. And part of how I can see it is because I work with both landlords and I work with tenants, but primarily because I'm a lawyer, I work with landlords, because the tenants I've represented, it's 50-50 whether they even pay me. Yeah. So I really think we're in this situation now where the government is simply trying to look good by passing that buck. And I mean, it'll be interesting, because I hope we end up having some members of our government, maybe local MPs or something like that, who actually show up to our conference, because this is something I really want them to hear, that realistically they're pushing off a problem that they don't want to deal with. They just want to look like they've dealt with it, but they're going to create a bigger black hole. They're going to create a massive issue in the long run, because you cannot expect the private person to take care of something like public housing and still be able to function. I have had landlords who were harassed and threatened by tenants while they were in the hospital with cancer, and there is no protection for them. There is nothing that they can do. If it was the other way around, of course, there's penalties that could happen to the landlord, but there is nothing you can do with a tenant. So these landlords, they already know they're putting themselves out there. Why would they ever continue to be a landlord, to incur that physical stress and that mental hardship of trying to navigate this complicated system and this broken board in order to just house people? That, if anything, if the government wants to make this kind of change, the government should be responsible for housing people who don't have enough money, period, end of story. Because the way they are approaching this disincentivizes every other private party from being involved. And it is certainly no one's individual duty. And I say this as someone who volunteers a lot and I take care of my community, but it is no individual's duty to take care of everyone else. No individual landlord should be responsible for affordable housing, like, period, end of story.
Well said.
The system can't simply control it, right? And I completely agree. Like I have a lot of landlords dealing with a lot of violent tenants and a lot of very distressing issues, right? I've had firearms pull on me in my office. I've had people threaten my assistant. I've had people come outside their properties with axes and knives. I've had people show up in front of my office where we have to now lock the doors in case a tenant shows up. There's a lot of issues that landlords deal with, right? And sometimes I have to say to a lot of my clients, how did you think that you would be able to go into this? And you see that the market correct itself, right? You see the complaints go up about landlords being a lot more stringent about getting into a unit. And it's like, well, I represent a lot of clients, and I have an office, I have people with me, and I still have people try to pull weapons on me. And that's as a representative. And people typically understand a representative is a representative. I'm not personally involved in the situation, but people still do that. So, the biggest issue that I'm telling with a lot of my clients is that, your entire investment, regardless of your cap rate, your purchase price, the mortgage, how you got the property, the deal, the sale, your realtor, your contractor, none of that matters. The tenant that goes in. Only the tenant. The tenant can cause such a significant issue, and if you pick a bad one, or they have a bad week, or a bad month, or they have some sort of social problem, or they fall off the face of the earth, whatever it may be, your property could go down in flames. Sometimes literally with some of my clients, right? So there's no incentive, and people.
There's no protection.
None.
There isn't. There just flatly isn't. Right. And I always tell everyone, it's like, if you're like, why would you want to buy a property in Ontario? Like, why? Like, it's the most ridiculous idea right now. Like, in a sense of, I'm an investor myself. I own property. I own property in Ethiopia. I own property here in Hamilton and in the GTA. And when I look at something now, it's completely different. Right. And of course, I have the benefit of working in landlord and tenant board laws. And, it's a little bit different for me because I know the ins and outs, and I can dig a little bit more on some people than most people can. But, the only thing this is going to cause, if you add more, I want to say the same thing was regulation or legislation, but you're going to find people that are going to take shortcuts. And right now, there's not that many representatives that say that's a bad decision, because the alternative is going foreclosed on. Yeah. And these people are going to become homeless. And it's like, well, the tenant has rights too. Yes, they do. But if you've worked your entire life buying a property, and this is your one property, if I had, if my client was LS on or was a large commercial company, and I was stealing trust money from a pension fund, I would go to jail.
Andrew,
right?
Remember that little sticker on the gas tanks that says, like, stealing gas is theft?
Yeah.
But we can allow a tenant to take advantage of a landlord and steal $50,000, $18,000, $25,000. Like the next after the show, I'm jumping on a call with a landlord who's been taking a year and a half just because the adjudicator would adjourn the hearing, didn't explain why they were adjourning it, and hasn't even rebooked. And this tenant is now $18,000 in arrears. So when you go with the concept of this article with the NDP and trying to call raising the rent in between tenancies a loophole, I think they should really focus on the loopholes that professional bad tenants are taking advantage of, because good tenants are paying the price for it. Good landlords are paying the price for it, and taxpayers are paying the price for it, because we're getting people out of this industry. And now that need to build government housing, to build it, manage it, maintain it, subsidize it, that need is now greater. That growing list for people waiting on government housing is greater. The homeless that we have to put into emergency shelters and pay $3,000 a month to house one person in emergency shelters, taxpayers are paying for that. We have to highlight the system that the government has put in place now, what those problems are and what the solutions are. They can't do it. We have the faces, you have your MPP, but you need to get into the policy advisors. You still need to make your call to the MPP. You have to make it to the Ontario Ombudsman, who's actively still investigating, probably until my youngest is going to be 18. But it's still same time, you still have to get to the Ombudsman, and you have to get to Doug Downey, the Attorney General. Make the noise that you need to say. Talk about what is going to happen if such a bill is going to be implemented, what that's going to do to your portfolio or where you invest, so that they can see their decisions are going to have a very bad ripple effect throughout the community. And we need to speak up for that. That's one thing that the landlords are very much failing on, is that we're not connected. We have multiple landlords associations. We have Facebook groups. We have municipal associations. We have provincial ones. The Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, they're going to be coming to the conference on October 1st to really dive deep into what they have experienced. They've hired a lobbyist. People have experienced, let's get a class action lawsuit. We've already been down that road. We can't do the class action lawsuit. So you feel like you're very defenseless and trying to make change. But at the same time, we have to bring that up. We have to do the work. We have to we already have our boots on the ground. Now let's give them the solutions. Because just because this NDP bill had stated that they have full rent control in between tenancies in Manitoba and Quebec, they think it's going to be a little bit more easier for the opposite party in order to agree with them. And instead, it's going to do far more damage to the landlords. It's going to do far more damage to the tenants. And we need to protect that, because this is an industry. We all pay, money for a real estate course to build, to grow, joint ventures, short-term rentals. We've always been trying to do that for that financial freedom, so that we're not so dependent on the government. We're not adequately informed of how important it is to advocate for this industry. So that's why I'm having this conference. This is my fourth one. We're having it at the Portuguese Club in Cambridge. We're going to highlight the top 5. We got 20 issues, but we're going to highlight the top 5 issues at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And together with the people on our panel, like Caitlin, like Andrew, we're going to dive deep into what that solution is with the audience. We really want to captivate the members that are from our community from all over Ontario. We even have people coming from Alberta. So they're going to give us some really good ideas into how things should be streamlined, so that we're not paying X amount of dollars, $19 million for more adjudicators. We need to address the major backlog, which is going to be the non-payment of rent, and also how they have multiple applications for multiple days for the same tenant. This is ludicrous, guys. So we're going to dive deep into the Landlord and Tenant Board. Then we got the Residential Tenancy Act. As you can see, we're doing the cash for keys. You have landlords saying that they're going to move their children in. You're going to get them to sell their property because they can't increase the rent. We need to work on different RTA legislation in order to make it fair for that business owner to be operating this type of business. Then we're going to get, like Caitlin talked about, the municipal side of things, where it makes it very difficult for us to develop housing, what that rezoning looks like. I know that we do have our housing task force, which was created by the Ford government, but not the right people on the task force, guys. So if you call me up, I'll be happy to sit there, or Caitlin or Andrew, anybody. Can we vote these people out and get some new people in? We have the task force. They are trying to work that 3 units on a single family dwelling. But guess what? Some of these mayors don't want it, and they're going to make sure to make it very difficult to not let it into their city, right? So we have to talk about that. We have to talk about the short-term rentals. Landlords are skipping out of long-term, getting into short-term. They have vacancy tax. We got water billing. We got landlord licensing. There's so much now that municipalities are trying to do, just like St. Catharines trying to charge landlords $500 to $1,000 per day for cutting off a vital service to their tenant over non-payment of rent. And this is where we come into, where is that fine line where now the municipalities are acting like a tribunal in favor of the tenant only? This is where we need to create that fairness and that balance that we need. And again, government housing. We have government housing. We have people in government housing that don't need to be in government housing. We have people in government housing frauding government housing. But there's no incentive to move out of government housing. We need government housing for people with more complex needs, for mental health, for addiction, because private landlords are not social workers. They're not going to be able to go and deal with a tenant with this type of issue. But if we can get government housing involved, work with the social workers to wrap them with those type of services, we can probably set them up with more success than dealing with a private investor that is going to evict them after. But that is going to be the talk of how to fix these issues in our panels. Then we're going to be having Samantha Glass. She's now going to be talking about the errors that our landlords are making. So it's going to highlight ones that we should be changing and ones to make sure that you're not making these type of errors. And she's also going to teach us how to represent yourself at the landlord and tenant board as well. And we have Sarah Larby. She's going to talk about tenant screening. This is the first line of defense, guys, when it comes down to tenant screening, making sure we're getting our right type of tenants. And we don't want to be this way. Don't get me wrong, but we now have to step up our screening process until justice is now restored within the landlord and tenant board. That is just fact. So it's going to hurt a lot of tenants, good tenants, but we do have to do this because we need to keep these properties so that it's not taken over by the bank, because when it does, they got to leave now anyways. And then we have Zach Killam. He's from FrontLobby. FrontLobby is where landlords are going to be able to report their unpaid rent and utilities to the Landlord Credit Bureau and Equifax monthly, so that other landlords are seeing the tenants who are abusing the system, using NDP word loophole, how to avoid not paying for rent and not having it affected their credit. So you're now going to be able to do that monthly without the tenant's consent and without a judgment. This is the key in us being able to create that system. We've even suggested it to our elected officials. If you have people in government housing and they pay their rent on time, report that rent payment, give them some incentives, help them get the credit. Because even if they get a good job, if they try to go into the private sector, guess what?
Yeah.
You don't have it. We're bringing the experts from all across Ontario in order to create this footage, get as many elected officials and staff to listen in, take notes, create this video that we're going to send to every elected official that I possibly can. And most importantly, I want to listen to the community. I need your solutions. I can have it in my head, whatever I think is good. We can all feed off of it. But when I'm meeting with these elected officials, I want your voices to be heard. And this is something that we've never quite had. I don't know how much more years I got for advocating, guys. I got 12 years. So pull up your socks. Come on with us. Andrew's going to be there. Caitlin, we have Zach, we have Melissa Dupree, we have, who else do we have? It's definitely, we have a squeeze from the Fropo. So it's going to be a jam-packed informational day. I'm providing you with food, so you don't even have to leave. We need to jam-pack this information into your head. So we want to make sure, but you have to register before September 15th in order to have your meal provided for you. After the 15th, if you register, then we won't be able to provide that meal for you. So I do apologize, but you can go into the links in this video and sign up, because if we're not collectively together, we're going to be seeing a lot of different type of bills similar to what the NDP is trying to push, and we need to speak up about it. And we're going to have the professionals and the experts who are deep into this mess, and we're going to try to help them with it for free. Don't worry, government, we ain't charging you. We're going to help you for free, fix the problems that you created. It's okay. You don't got to thank us. We just, give me some tax incentives. It'd be awesome. But no, I was just joking. But Caitlin, give me, what do we want to give our members here before? Why do they need to come to the Ontario Landlords Watch Conference?
Well, honestly, I think you kind of summarized it pretty well, but they genuinely need to come to understand better their own rights, their own responsibilities, and the risks of not advocating for yourself and not really pushing the landlord agenda in this day and age, because all we're going to see is less benefits for all parties involved, including tenants, by the way. Like, as a tenant, I don't want this bill to go through because I think I might end up not being able to have the same renting prospects. So come so you understand your rights and your responsibilities and you know what's coming next.
Awesome. Andrew.
Well, you should come because it's my opinion. If you don't have this information, you're not a landlord. You're just a person that has a house. That's what you are. You're just an owner of a house, right? If you want to be a landlord, if you want to be able to do your job and do it well and know the pitfalls of actually doing the job as an investor, as a housing provider, as a landlord, whichever title you want to take on, you're going to need to know this stuff. Otherwise, it's not about, if you can't do it, you won't be able to do it. It's not possible. It's so much information that you're not going to be able to find out on your own. So go into your community that knows this information, go to the people that has this information, and network, have those support systems that are around you, because as of right now, you're going up an uphill battle, up a mountain, trying to scale a cliff, and you're not going to be able to do it on your own. And it only takes one bad situation and you don't have the correct information, and then you're out of the market completely. So I would highly recommend you show up because it should be bloody mandatory.
Yeah,
wow.
I agree.
That's the thing. Don't get them too many ideas. Now we have mandatory landlord courses before you.
No, yeah, actually.
Oh, no. None of that.
It's definitely a learn. It's definitely a learn as you go situation. But if you can learn from other people who went through that, past mistakes, and that's why we have Ontario Landlords Watch Facebook page in order to build. That's now at 7,000 people strong with, a waiting list trying to get in. We need to build that network. So when we do this call to action where we have to come and we have to fight against the NDP to show our conservative government that this is not a good idea. This is the trickle effect. That's what's going to happen if you even take a little piece of this. I just hope from what you see is that, yes, this is full blown, no rent increases in between tenancies. And I hope that they don't get that idea of only allowing landlords to raise that rate through a certain percentage. I'm thinking they'll give us a timbit. So there's always so much on the go, especially when they think encampments are a form of housing. And now Justin Trudeau is traveling into major of the richest cities to understand the affordability sector of things. A lot of moving parts are happening because there is a municipal election. So get yourself involved with municipal elections, the provincial election, the federal election. And if you have a regional one, stay very heavily involved in that. But we have to do more. And I want to create more of me. If I can create more of me in order to get to these elected officials and understand this issue, because I've been doing it for 20 years and I come from the family of tenants. My husband comes from the family of landlords, and we're really just trying to create a fair and balanced housing system. But things have to change, and it has to change in a very big way. It may be political suicide for some people, but at the same time, we have to do what's better for all the parties involved, including our taxpayers. Caitlin, Andrew, we'll put it in the link there. You can see where you can find Andrew or Caitlin, because they're a wealth of knowledge. They're obviously going to be at the housing conference now on October 1st. So make sure that you guys register quickly so that we can get you in. Come say hello and share it with your friends. This is the call to action. We're now in a war. It's a war. I think more regulations and is going to be coming, and we have to get organized like the tenant activists are. So let's do whatever we can to create that fair and balanced housing system for everyone. And we'll see you again on the Canadian Real Estate Channel. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe, and we're looking forward. We got some work to do on October 1st.